As we continue our series exploring chronic fatigue syndrome and other invisible illnesses, I want to bring you back to a powerful moment from a TED Talk delivered 9 years ago. The speaker, a woman living with myalgic encephalitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, shared something that still echoes deeply in today's conversations around chronic illnesses, medical bias, and patient suffering. Listen closely. As you do, I'll offer a few reflections about where we were then and where we are now, especially in light of new research that has made big strides into understanding chronic fatigue syndrome and other related nociplastic pain conditions like fibromyalgia.
5 years ago, this was me. I was a PhD student at Harvard, and I loved to travel. I had just gotten engaged to marry the love of my life. I was 28, and like so many of us when we are in good health, I felt like I was invincible. Then one day I had a fever of 104.7 degrees. I probably should have gone to the doctor, but I'd never really been sick in my life. And I knew that usually if you have a virus, you stay home and you make some chicken soup, and in a few days, everything will be fine. But this time it wasn't fine. After the fever broke, for 3 weeks, I was so dizzy, I couldn't leave my house. I would walk straight into door frames. I had to hug the walls just to make it to the bathroom. That spring, I got infection after infection. And every time I went to the doctor, he said there was absolutely nothing wrong. He had his laboratory tests, which always came back normal.
This so poignantly resonates with many living with long COVID.
All I had were my symptoms, which I could describe, but no one else can see. Then the neurological symptoms started. I saw every kind of specialist: infectious disease doctors, rheumatologists, endocrinologists, cardiologists. I even saw a psychiatrist. My psychiatrist said, "It's clear you're really sick, but not with anything psychiatric. I hope they can find out what's wrong with you."
In the next 4 episodes, we are going to look at psychological testing and assessments that were done in the NIH study, as well as studies by Dr. Joel Young, which brings important insights to our understanding of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia.
The next day, my neurologist diagnosed me with conversion disorder. He told me that everything, the fevers, the sore throats, the sinus infection, all of the gastrointestinal, neurological, and cardiac symptoms were being caused by some distant emotional trauma that I could not remember. The symptoms were real, he said, but they had no biological cause.
This theory of repressed emotional trauma that causes persistent pain goes back to the days of Sigmund Freud and often are still touted in popular podcasts and books as explanations for living with chronic pain. I plan to take a deeper dive into this in future episodes.
I ran a small experiment. I walked back the 2 miles from my neurologist's office to my house, my legs wrapped in this strange, almost electric kind of pain. I meditated on that pain, contemplating how my mind could have possibly generated all this. As soon as I walked through the door, I collapsed. My brain and my spinal cord were burning. I would spend most of the next 2 years in bed. How could my doctor have gotten it so wrong? I thought I had a rare disease, something doctors had never seen. And then I went online and found thousands of people all over the world living with the same symptoms, similarly isolated, similarly disbelieved. Some were so sick, they had to live in complete darkness, unable to tolerate the sound of a human voice or the touch of a loved one. I was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis. You probably heard it called chronic fatigue syndrome. If my husband goes for a run, he might be sore for a couple of days. If I try to walk half a block, I might be bedridden for a week. It is a perfect custom prison. I know ballet dancers who can't dance, accountants who can't add, medical students who never became doctors. It doesn't matter what you once were. You can't do it anymore. It's been 4 years, and I've still never been as well as I was the minute before I walked home from my neurologist's office. It's estimated that about 15 to 30 million people around the world have this disease. In the US, where I'm from, it's about 1 million people. That makes it roughly twice as common as multiple sclerosis. Patients can live for decades with the physical function of someone with congestive heart failure. 25% of us are homebound or bedridden, and 75 to 85% of us can't even work part-time. Yet doctors do not treat us, and science does not study us. How could a disease this common and this devastating have been forgotten by medicine?
Thankfully, medicine has not forgotten chronic fatigue syndrome and related illnesses, as evidenced by this NIH study that was started over 6 years ago by Dr. Avindra Nath and his colleagues.
Sigmund Freud developed a theory that the unconscious mind could produce physical symptoms when dealing with memories or emotions too painful for the conscious mind to handle. And in the case of ME, psychological explanations have held back biological research. All around the world, ME is one of the least funded diseases. So in the US, we spend each year roughly $2,500 per AIDS patient, $250 per MS patient, and just $5 per year per ME patient. This was not just lightning. I was not just unlucky. The ignorance surrounding my disease had been a choice made by the institutions that were supposed to protect us. We don't know why ME sometimes runs in families, why you can get it after almost any infection from enteroviruses to Epstein-Barr virus to Q fever, or why it affects women at 2 to 3 times the rate of men. What also gives me hope is the resilience of patients. Online, we came together and we shared our stories. We devoured what research there was. We experimented on ourselves. We became our own scientists and our own doctors because we had to be. And slowly I added 5% here, 5% there, until eventually, on a good day, I was able to leave my home. I still had to make ridiculous choices. Will I sit in the garden for 15 minutes, or will I wash my hair today? But it gave me hope that I could be treated. I had a sick body, that was all. And with the right kind of help, maybe one day I could get better. But I am so grateful for how far I have come. Progress is slow, and it is up, and it is down. But I am getting a little better each day. Had I gotten sick before the internet, had I not found my community, I probably would have already taken my own life, as so many others have done. How many lives could we have saved decades ago if we had asked the right questions?
That line is devastating and sadly still relevant. Suicide is tragically more common in patients with invisible illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome. Why? Because when you feel invalidated, dismissed, and hopeless, despair takes root. The science has been thankfully catching up slowly, but 9 years later, many patients still wait years, sometimes decades, for a diagnosis. The right questions are still too rarely asked, and most physicians are not keeping up to date and have dismissed this whole group of patients that unfortunately is falling through the cracks. That's why this podcast exists.
Doctors, scientists, and policymakers are not immune to the same biases that affect all of us. We need to think in more nuanced ways about women's health. We need to listen to patients' stories. And we need to be willing to say, I don't know. I don't know is a beautiful thing.
She's right. Clinicians like myself are trained in science, but we're also human. We're shaped by what's taught and what's left out. And for too long, the medical establishment has underestimated or misunderstood complex chronic illnesses, especially when patients, often women, present with symptoms that don't fit neatly into conventional test results. We need more nuance in all of medicine, especially where conditions involve the nervous system, immune system, and gut-brain interaction known as nociplastic pain syndromes. This includes fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos, long COVID, and more. These conditions demand a shift in how we frame complex multi-system illness, not just in women, but across the board.
I don't know is where discovery starts. And if we can do that, if we can approach the great vastness of all that we do not know, and then rather than fear uncertainty, maybe we can greet it with a sense of wonder. Thank you. Thank you.
A sense of wonder. That's something we don't talk enough about in medicine, especially in these complex overlapping conditions where the different organ systems, along with neurodivergence, converge. We need that wonder. We need that humility. The human body is incredibly choreographed, an intricate dance of biological systems working in harmony. But when that balance is disrupted, whether by infection, trauma, stress, genetics, or the environment or adverse life experiences, the nervous system can shift into a state of distress or dysregulation. What once functioned effortlessly begins to break down, often in ways that we can't see on standard lab work or imaging. That's why we need a bio, psycho, social, spiritual, and environmental approach, because no one factor tells the whole story. We are more than our biology, more than our symptoms. We are shaped by our lived experiences, our relationships, belief systems, communities, and the environment we inhabit. To truly understand conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, long COVID, and so many others, we have to zoom out to see the whole person in their whole context. 9 years after that TED Talk, we've made some progress. Research has grown, awareness is better, but patients are still falling through the cracks, often unheard, misdiagnosed, or shuffled between specialists who each see only one piece of the puzzle. That's why we're doing the series, to shine a light, to connect the dots, and to return medicine to its most human form, listening, learning, and walking alongside those we serve with science, yes, but also with deep-grounded compassion. If this story resonates with you, stay with us. We've got more to explore and more voices to honor.
Yeah. So trying to distill that and trying to define the disease much better is really important. So in fact, out of this thing, what has also come out is that we need better criteria to diagnose these patients and better criteria to conduct clinical trials going forward. So we met last year in Hingston, which is close to Cambridge in the UK, and there was an MECFS meeting. So we put together, myself and a whole host of researchers from all around the world. We sat around the table and we tried to put together criteria that we can use for uniform criteria that we can use for clinical trials. Because otherwise, everybody has their own way of doing these things. And then you can't compare one study against the other. So we're going to call it the Hingston criteria. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. So we haven't fully finalized it, but we're getting very close to it. And then we're going to publish it. And hopefully people will use those things going forward for doing clinical trials. We've shown for certain that this is a biological disease. Okay. We've shown for certain that there are certain types of immune parameters that are abnormal. There's certain types of other abnormalities. They have metabolic abnormalities, a whole host of abnormalities. And there are a number of clinical criteria that are uniformly present in these patients. And I think combining these kinds of things is what we need to do to go forwards and start with clinical trials in these patients.
In the study that you did, the huge study with 70 investigators, team working on these 20 patients, comparing them to controls, trying to put through the identical evaluation workup, trying to get them after you've gotten more pure group of patients. There's two parts to this. What were the discoveries that you found that turned out to be no different? That's one aspect, like there was no difference in controls or partial differences. And what were the findings that you found that were different? I don't know which one you want to start with first.
Yeah, no, we'll go in the order as you asked the questions. What we didn't find is actually the easy part, because a lot of what we tested, we didn't find differences in.
So what did their research say? What were some of the things that they did find were different? Well, one area that we didn't get a chance to talk about during the interview in extensive detail was looking at autonomic dysfunction. The researchers looked at several different measures to understand how the autonomic nervous system behaves
in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. So let's break it down. Did the tilt table testing show any differences? Surprisingly, no. When participants were tested on a tilt table for up to 40 minutes, there weren't any significant group differences. That means that both chronic fatigue syndrome participants and healthy controls showed similar rates of orthostatic hypotension, or excessive heart rate increases, or symptoms severe enough to stop the test. Now, when we look at those who have POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, which falls under the umbrella of neuroplastic pain syndromes like chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, there wasn't an excessive heart rate increase. Before we get into, and just diving a little more deeper, autonomic nervous system has to deal more with the autopilot part of our nervous system. We do not tell our heart to slow down or speed up. We don't tell our intestines to digest food. That is too much to keep track of. So our body and our nervous system has a separate autopilot that gets affected by that. They looked at heart rate variability. That's where things get more interesting. Using 24-hour EKG testing, the researchers found that people with chronic fatigue syndrome had lower heart rate variability. This is a measure of how well the body's autonomic nervous system adapts to changes throughout the day. These are indicators of reduced autonomic flexibility, especially in the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. Let's take a closer look at the two key branches of the autonomic or autopilot nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Imbalances between them may play a significant role in chronic pain and fatigue. The sympathetic nervous system is often called the fight or flight system. It kicks in when we perceive a threat, increasing heart rate, dilating pupils, and sending blood to the muscles so that we can respond quickly. It's essential for survival, but it's meant to be for short term. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system is known as the rest and digest system. It helps the body relax, digest food, repair tissue, and conserve energy. These two systems work together in balance, like a seesaw. But here's the problem. When the sympathetic system is chronically overactive, what researchers call sympathetic dominance, the body stays in a state of stress. Over time, this can lead to inflammation, heightened pain sensitivity, poor sleep, and deep fatigue. Recent research, including studies on conditions like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and even long COVID, shows that individuals with chronic pain and fatigue have a dysregulated autonomic nervous system. Their sympathetic nervous system is often stuck in high gear, while the parasympathetic system struggles to counterbalance it. This imbalance doesn't just affect the body, it affects the brain too. It can alter how we perceive pain and how much energy we have to get through the day. The good news, there are strategies to help calibrate this to a proper balance. But it is complicated and involves the biopsychosocial, social, spiritual, environmental approach. This means that those with chronic pain have an inherited vulnerability, a preset wiring that has to be contended with. There are social, spiritual, and environmental dilemmas to face. These create unique challenges for the individual struggling with chronic pain and fatigue issues. This podcast has many episodes that discuss the nature of these challenges and will continue to explore strategies in future episodes. But for now, just knowing that your nervous system might be stuck in overdrive can help you be a little gentler with yourself. In the NIH study, indicators used to assess the complexity of heart rate signals were significantly altered in the chronic fatigue syndrome group. How did heart rates behave over the course of the day? Two key patterns stood out. First, people with chronic fatigue syndrome had higher overall heart rates throughout the day, which suggests increased sympathetic or fight or flight activity. Second, they didn't show the typical nighttime drop in heart rate, which points to reduced parasympathetic or rest and digest function. What did the researchers find about the baroreflex function? There were signs of dysfunction there too. The chronic fatigue syndrome group had a lower baroreflex slope, and it took them longer to recover their blood pressure after doing the Valsalva maneuver, a test that evaluates how well the body manages changes in blood pressure. An important study entitled Comparing Autonomic Nervous System Function in Patients with Functional Somatic Syndromes, Stress-Related Syndromes, and Healthy Controls, published December 2024, set out to do this. The researchers wanted to understand why so many who are listening can relate to, which is having gone to the doctor with symptoms like headaches, fatigue, dizziness, or digestive trouble, only to be told that all your tests are normal. You're not alone. The researchers in this paper shared that between 40 and 49% of patients in primary care and up to 76% of frequent healthcare users report physical symptoms that can't be fully explained by the typical biomedical understanding from the historic framework. So what's going on in these cases? Well, these unexplained symptoms often show up in two broad categories: stress-related syndromes like burnout and overstrain, and what in the world of psychology and psychiatry have often been called functional somatic syndromes, such as fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. What exactly are stress-related syndromes? They're clusters of physical and psychological symptoms that develop after prolonged stress. Think of overstrain as the early stage. It involves poor sleep, irritability, trouble relaxing, and cognitive issues lasting more than 3 months. When that persists over 6 months and fatigue becomes dominant, which they call burnout. And what about functional somatic syndromes? Functional somatic syndromes is a term used in the psychological realm and are synonymous with neuroplastic pain syndromes, which is a more up-to-date term from pain science. These are chronic conditions like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. They cause widespread pain, extreme tiredness, brain fog, and a host of other symptoms, but without clear structural or organic abnormalities to explain them. Both are complex, often long-lasting, and tend to overlap in symptoms, causes, and even treatment responses. And here's where it gets interesting. Chronic stress appears to be a major driver in both. But how does stress affect the body so deeply? So what does the research say about the autonomic nervous system in these conditions? Many studies suggest people with functional somatic syndromes show signs of sympathetic dominance. That means a higher resting heart rate, lower heart rate variability, and poor recovery from stress. But until now, no one had directly compared the autonomic nervous system of people with those of functional somatic syndromes to those with stress-related syndromes like burnout. And that's exactly what the study published in December of 2024 set out to do. The researchers measured several indicators of autonomic activity, including heart rate variability, skin conductance, and skin temperature in 3 groups: patients with functional somatic syndromes, patients with stress-related syndromes, and healthy controls. They looked at how each group responded to a lab stressor and, importantly, how well they recovered afterwards. So what did they find? They compared these 2 groups to healthy controls, and the results were revealing. The study measured several markers at rest, during stress, and after stress. These included heart rate variability, skin conductance levels, and skin temperature. The goal was to understand not just how the body reacts to stress, but also how it recovers afterwards, and whether the patterns differ between chronic illness and chronic stress. So what did they find? First, both patient groups, those with functional somatic syndromes and those with stress-related syndromes, had higher resting heart rates and lower heart rate variability compared to healthy controls. That's consistent with previous research and points to sympathetic or fight-or-flight nervous system activity and reduced parasympathetic activity. Interestingly, when exposed to stress, both groups had a weaker increase in heart rate and a smaller decrease during recovery. This might sound counterintuitive. Shouldn't a more reactive stress system mean more response, not less? But this blunted response could actually signal a kind of wear and tear. When your nervous system is constantly activated, it may eventually lose its ability to respond dynamically, sort of like an engine that's been running too hot for too long. Both groups also showed reduced heart rate variability during the recovery phase. This pattern, higher resting heart rate, lower heart rate variability, and a muted response to stress suggests that these individuals might be stuck in a kind of chronic stress loop, where the system is on high alert but can no longer respond adaptively. The researchers also looked at skin conductance, which measures sweating and is another way to track sympathetic nervous system activity. Again, both groups had higher skin conductance at rest compared to healthy controls, and those with functional somatic syndromes had a bigger increase in response to stress. However, there weren't big differences during recovery, possibly because participants were anticipating another stressor, which may have kept their stress levels elevated. When it comes to skin temperature, though, there were no significant differences between the groups. While skin temperature did not change with stress, it didn't help distinguish between chronic illness, chronic stress, and health. One particularly important takeaway was how similar the physiological patterns were between the functional somatic syndrome group and the stress-related syndrome groups. That suggests these conditions might share more than just symptoms. They may also share underlying biological mechanisms like chronic sympathetic dominance and a worn-out stress response system. Now, the researchers did acknowledge a few limitations. For example, the different groups were diagnosed in different clinical settings, which could have introduced some variability, and the healthy controls were pre-screened for low negative emotion and low symptom reporting, which may have made them super healthy compared to the general population. Plus, the study didn't include detailed data on heart rate variability during the stress tests themselves, since those tests involve talking, which can interfere with heart rate variability readings. Despite these limitations, the findings have some intriguing clinical applications. If people with stress-related conditions show signs of autonomic nervous system dysfunction, then interventions that target the autonomic nervous system could help. In fact, previous research has shown that heart rate variability biofeedback, a therapy that helps people train their nervous systems, can reduce pain and fibromyalgia and improve mental health and energy levels in chronic fatigue syndrome. There's also evidence that biofeedback can reduce burnout symptoms, especially in high-stress environments like school or the workplace. In summary, this study suggests that functional somatic syndromes and stress-related syndromes are marked by heightened sympathetic activity and blunted cardiovascular response to stress. These could be transdiagnostic features, meaning they show up across different conditions, not just one specific diagnosis. It's a reminder that when we talk about chronic pain or burnout, we're not just talking about symptoms. We're also talking about a body that may have been stuck in survival mode for too long. Understanding this connection between stress, the nervous system, and chronic illness could be a game changer, not just for the treatment, but for how we think about health itself. So what's the big picture? Taken together, all these findings point to an altered autonomic tone in people with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. This suggests a shift in how the central nervous system regulates autonomic functions, potentially a key feature of the condition. Another key finding that stood out was that participants with chronic fatigue syndrome had a much harder time reaching their expected peak performance during physical testing. This points to a difference likely tied to issues with the autonomic nervous system, a less responsive stress hormone system, and muscle conditioning for long periods of reduced activity. And this wasn't just something that showed up in the lab. When researchers looked at real-world movement using wearable activity trackers, they saw that people with chronic fatigue syndrome were taking fewer steps and logging less overall activity, especially moderate intensity movement. It's a clear indication that these physiological changes are affecting their everyday lives in meaningful ways. So Dr. Nath shares that most of what they tested, and they did an in-depth evaluation, you can dive into that more in the article, but they found that there weren't major differences. We'll be hearing more about some of the important findings that they did find, some major differences.
Okay. So vast majority of the things, there was no difference. Now, there could be two reasons for it. One is that, yes, there is no biological difference. If you do 1,000 different tests, not everything's going to turn out to be different, right? You expect that a lot of things would be, otherwise people would be close to dead anyways. The other possibility is that, yes, there are things that we may have missed. They could very well be abnormal in these patients, but we only studied a very small patient population. And as homogeneous as we may have tried to identify the population, they're still biologically different. If you have differences in individuals, then your sample size is too small to be able to tell differences. So now if you find a statistically significant difference in any parameter, in a small sample size, that means the effect size is huge.
All right, let's talk about the term effect size, which Dr. Nath just mentioned. It sounds technical, but it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. Let me walk you through it so it makes sense, whether you're into science or just curious about how studies work. Size is basically a way of measuring how big a difference or how strong a relationship is between two things in a study. Think of it like this. If you're testing whether a new energy drink helps people run faster, effect size doesn't just tell you whether it works, it tells you how much it works. How is that different from statistical significance? Statistical significance tells us whether something is likely due to chance or not. It's kind of a yes or no question. Did we see a real effect or just random noise? But effect size answers the more important question, is the effect actually meaningful? Because here's the thing. You can have a statistically significant result that barely makes a difference in real life. For example, a pill that lowers the dementia score by half a point on a 30-point scale might be statistically significant, but who cares? That's where effect size steps in. So what does it mean when researchers say there's a large effect size? That means the difference is not only real, it's big enough to matter. A large effect size is like saying, wow, this really moved the needle. Going back to the energy drink example, a large effect size might mean people are running a full minute faster, not just shaving off a second or two. It's the difference between interesting and impactful. Going back to the dementia study example, a large effect size might mean there was a 5 or 6 point improvement, not just a half a point. Why should we care about this? Because when we're talking about health, education, or treatment outcomes, we want to know what's going on to make a real difference in someone's life. Large effect sizes help us focus on what actually works and not just on what works on paper. So next time you hear someone say, the study had a large effect size, you'll know that science speak for the thing might actually do something.
Okay. So those things are very important to pay close attention to. You can still get a false positive, but the chances of those are very small. Mm. So we found a number of things, and I think that's the important thing about a small sample size is that you can study them extensively and you can identify certain parameters that are probably very important in understanding disease pathogenesis that can then be confirmed in larger populations, right? So you can identify now a handful of things. You say these things were abnormal in this patient population. Now, if you're going to study a larger population, we don't have to do all the 1,000 tests on that large population, but let's just do this small subset now and see how many of them stand up testing in a larger population.
So just having gone through this study myself, looking through, there's that area of muscle strength. What did you find in the difference in muscle strength in those with CFS and those were controls?
Yeah. So the connections are intact. That means the muscle itself is healthy. The connections from the brain to the muscle do exist, but they're unable to exert the same kind of force that a healthy individual can do. Right?
Over the duration of time, as time of persisting with a continuous effort starts to diminish, but there wasn't necessarily anything different about the muscle itself on biopsy, which is important to recognize. That rules out, is it a end organ problem? It isn't the muscle itself that's diseased or the peripheral nerves that are connecting to the muscle that are injured.
So I think that's very important because what it tells you is that if you could fix the underlying problem, you could get these patients to recover. You see that? If your muscle was totally damaged, you're not going to recover. What we're trying to say is that if you fix the problem, you actually have a good chance of helping these patients.
Yes. And often many people who have these invisible type illnesses, CFS, may have gone to a neurologist, community clinician, and part of the workup may have been an EMG.
So we mentioned an EMG. It may sound sci-fi, but actually a really important tool in medicine. It stands for electromyography. Now, if that word just made your brain short circuit a little, don't worry. Here's the simple version. An EMG is a test that looks at how your muscles and nerves that control them are working. Think of it like this. Your nerves are like electrical wires, and your muscles are the machines they control. The EMG helps doctors figure out whether the wiring is messed up, the machine is malfunctioning, or both. How does it work? During the test, tiny sensors called electrodes are placed on your skin or even into the muscle itself with a small needle. These sensors pick up the electrical signals your muscles make when you move or even when you're just resting. Then a machine records those signals and shows the patterns. From there, the doctor can tell whether the muscle is getting the right messages from the nerve and how well it's responding. What can an EMG diagnose? Quite a few things, actually. It's used when people have symptoms like muscle weakness, numbness, tingling, or cramping that doctors can't fully explain. An EMG can help diagnose conditions like carpal tunnel syndrome, which is when the median nerve in your wrist gets compressed constantly over time. Peripheral neuropathy, often things like diabetes, where nerves in your hands or feet are damaged, or herniated discs in your spine that press on nerves, or even more complex conditions like ALS or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which affects the nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. So in short, an EMG is like a nerve and muscle detective. It helps figure out why you're having certain symptoms and where the problem is coming from, whether it's in the nerve, the muscle, or how they're talking to each other. It's not the most fun test in the world. It can be a little uncomfortable, but it can be incredibly useful for getting answers and guiding the right treatment. So if your doctor recommends an EMG, now you know. It's not a big fancy word. It's a powerful tool to help understand what's going on in your body.
The muscle is fine, but you're not fine.
Exactly. And that's often where leaves patients frustrated. And often that's why you're trying to investigate. When you talk about the effort part, there was also seemed to be a diminishment in, and you can put it in, like I say, talking about the power of language in English, the ability to cognitively continue with the effort to the muscle seemed to be diminished. And also it seemed like there was a perception difference on when they thought they were done, like I can't do anymore, their level of percent exertion. One of the studies, they talked about the muscle strength, and it seemed to imply that the cognitive effort diminished. The brain gave up before the muscle.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, so whatever the reason is, they are unable to exert complete effort in there. We think there's a biological reason for it, okay? Because when we looked at the spinal fluid, we found that there were neurotransmitters that were different, a lot of metabolic abnormalities that were different. And so we think that their inability to exert is dictated by these fundamental abnormalities within the brain itself. Okay. And I think that is important because a lot of people interpret that maybe it's trying to suggest this psychological or something. I don't think that was never our interpretation of the data or our thought. So we think that there's a biological basis for it. And I think because we use the word effort preference, people got quite upset by use of the terminology. But really, and I'm not a physiologist, but apparently in these physiology circles, that word preference means something totally different than the way we think of it in the lay language. Basically, the bottom line is that we think there's a biological basis for the inability to exert the amount of effort going forward.
And you said there's difference in neurotransmitter levels found on spinal fluid. That was part of that. I think there's some differences in dopamine levels and other factors. Diving in a little deeper, effort preference is a concept used by exercise physiologists and psychologists to describe an individual's tendency or willingness to choose physical or mental tasks that require more or less effort, even when easier alternatives are available. In exercise physiology, effort preference helps explain why some people are more inclined to engage in vigorous activity while others prefer light or moderate exercise. It's not just about physical capacity, it reflects motivational, cognitive, and emotional factors that influence how much effort someone is willing to exert. In psychology, particularly in areas like behavioral science and motivation theory, effort preference can relate to how individuals weigh the costs and benefits of exerting effort, whether physical or cognitive. This includes constructs like need for cognition or preference for mentally demanding tasks,
effort discounting or devaluing rewards that require more effort, and the delay versus effort trade-offs, which is choosing between low effort, delayed reward versus a high effort, immediate reward. What are the clinical applications? This includes exercise adherence. People with a high effort preference may be more likely to stick with demanding workout programs. In rehabilitation, understanding effort preference can help tailor interventions to meet individuals where they are, increasing compliance. In mental health and chronic illnesses and conditions like depression, ADHD, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and other nociplastic pain syndromes, this may alter effort preference, leading individuals to avoid tasks they previously tolerated. During next week's episode, we will talk more about the intriguing findings that Dr. Nath and his team found on functional MRIs of the brain that give a more in-depth analysis. Talk about what the findings were in the functional MRI and give a lay definition of what a functional MRI is for those who aren't clinicians, and then what were the findings with that?
Yeah. So these are people, MRI is imaging of the brain, but yet it is not an image like you take a photograph of the brain. What it is, it's a magnet that aligns all your protons together. Okay. And then when the magnet relaxes, those protons flip. And so there's a whole mathematical derivation that the instrument is putting together. It's looking at how quickly these protons are coming back to where they were. Right? And then it takes those mathematical numbers, and then from there it derives an image. Okay, so you actually never image the brain. So these brilliant people, and I'm no physicist, so what they figured out is that you can do it in the same way that if your brain is just at resting, okay, you'll have a slightly different property versus when you're activating the brain. Right? Because now things are moving and neurons are moving and certain areas are more active than the other. So these mathematical derivations are going to be different. So you can actually tell what part of the brain is active and which is not, even in a resting state of the brain. So we call that a functional MRI scan because it's telling you something about the function. Although MRI itself is telling you about the anatomy of the brain, but because of this property of the magnet, you can actually do a functional derivation of the brain.
Yes, it's
Okay. So what we found was that there is this area called the parieto-temporal junction. So that's where your parietal lobe, your frontal lobe, and your temporal lobe comes together. And that's where a lot of things get integrated into the brain. So that was hypoactive in these patients. So that what it tells you is there's a circuit problem within the brain. It's not an anatomical problem because the anatomical MRI is normal. But when you do the functional MRI, you find there's an abnormality. But the abnormality is in a very precise region of the brain, and that is where everything is getting integrated. And that ability to integrate it is what is impaired.
and that functional MRI during this study, correct me if I'm wrong, was done during effort tasks. Was that while they were trying to do exertional activities, if I remember right?
Yeah, so they gave them a physical task to do, but they also do it in resting state. That means without anything, and you can do the functional MRI.
And
It's called
so,
a cold imaging or resting state.
yes, and so they found a difference with that effort in that part of the brain, what you said it's trying to integrate. There was a hypoactivity, a lower activity of that, and which confirms a lot of things of the brain and something happening organically, a difference in that part of the brain, like you said, psychologically, and even the word psychologically in the past, often, unfortunately, many people are thought of you're just hypochondriac, it's just you're being lazy, and yet we know there's a difference in part of the brain that is imaging, which is overlapping with the CFS fibromyalgia that we are finding that's a central pain processing difference in how this is. Often the headliner of CFS is the fatigue with activity. Also, there's other factors that are along with it, but this one specifically was identifying with that effort, there was something different. It was harder for them to push.
That's correct. Yes.
And that's validating for so many people who are living with this, and I think very insightful.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, everybody should be assured that they have a real disease that requires specific interventions. Not only that, we didn't discuss the immune aspects of it. We found very distinct immune abnormalities in these patients. We found evidence of immune exhaustion, right? And so when we looked at their lymphocytes, we found that they're very specific. When your lymphocytes get exhausted, they produce certain types of markers that get expressed on top of these cells. And we found that those markers are actually increased in these individuals, suggesting their lymphocytes are exhausted.
That's probably not a good thing for our immune system get exhausted. But
Yeah.
can you elaborate on what that means functionally and how you measure that?
Okay. So that is a term that we've borrowed from the cancer doctors. The cancer doctors have been really good at, the researchers, I should say, have been really good at measuring these things. What they show is that if you have cancer, and their hypothesis, an interesting hypothesis about cancer is that we all have some cancer cells that are produced throughout our lives. But the reason we all don't develop cancer is because your immune cells keep them in check. So every day you're getting rid of your cancer cells that are emerging from your body. At some point, what happens is your immune system fails and the cancer emerges. So they said, okay, if the immune system is important in controlling it, then what's happening to the immune system when this cancer is there? They find that, okay, you know what? Actually, you have these cells that should have been targeting the cancer. They're still there, but they're not doing their job. They now see it and it's, I don't recognize you any longer. So they said, what's wrong with these cells? Why did they fail at doing their job? And they found that what was happening is they were exhausted. They've been doing it, and then after a while, they just got exhausted. But they're not dead. They're still there. And then what they found was, these brilliant people found that actually these exhausted cells, if you look at them, they have very specific markers on top of them that prevent them from doing their job. And there are 3-4 different molecules. One is called PD1, there's TIGIT, there's LG3, there are a number of these kinds of molecules there. Okay. So what they found was that they get overexpressed on these cells. Now, what the cancer docs did was they said, okay, if these markers are overexpressed and that's preventing them from doing their job, but these cells are not dead yet, what if we actually block these molecules? Let's see what will happen. And so they did that. They blocked it. Now they started attacking the tumor again. So Jimmy Carter received that treatment. The reason that he survived so long after he had that cancer, and he didn't die of cancer ultimately. Yeah? He died of old age. But the was because he received one of those treatments that blocked that PD1. And his immune cells were able to go and clear the cancer, even though he had brain metastases. Nobody survived from brain metastases before. You get brain metastases, you're dead. Your survival is 1 or 2 months if you're lucky. Yeah. And he survived several years.
What cancer did he have?
Malignant melanoma, the skin.
Are those what they call the checkpoint inhibitors?
Yeah, checkpoint inhibitors. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So that's what he received. He received this drug called pembrolizumab, which is a checkpoint inhibitor. It blocks PD1 molecule. So what we found in the ME/CFS patients is something very similar. Now, they don't have cancer, but they've got exhausted cells. So the question is, why do they have immune exhaustion? Now, the thing is that everybody has different types of infections. So it's not like they all have the same virus or the same bacteria or whatever it was, but maybe they have the same abnormality in the immune system.
This exhaustion mirrors what a lot of people feel. What do we know about susceptibility to infections and autoimmune connections with
Yes.
CFS phenotype of patients?
Yes. So actually, our study shed light on a lot of that too. Okay. So what we found is that if you talk to a lot of these patients who have ME/CFS, they report they have repeated infections. A number of them have repeated infections, and every time they have an infection, they develop more and more ME/CFS-like symptoms. So they will tell you, yeah, I had this infection when I was a kid, and I got these symptoms, but actually I got better. It took me a long time, but I got better. So maybe you and I have an infection, we get better in 10 days or something. And it might take them a month to get better or 2 months to get better. They got better. Then they had another one And again, it took a long time for them to get better. Then they had the third one, they never got better. So it tells you that the way that they're reacting to infections is different than anybody else. So our hypothesis is that there's genetically something wrong with them in the way they react to infections. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm very eager to, and I think the same thing is the problem with long COVID. And so because we found the same immune exhaustion that we find in ME/CFS patients in the long COVID patients too. So now I'm very eager to try and understand, is there a genetic basis behind all of this?
All of these make me as a physician reflect on two broader pictures. One is it's incredible how complicated our body is and how incredibly choreographed everything has to be. And yet one thing gets out of balance and it can start to have a chain reaction. So many people with CFS by nature will have insomnia and will often have now poor eating habits because they're stressed, and they often are susceptible to the Western diet, which now we know gut biome affects immune function, and then the gut brain interaction. There's the idea of these neuroimmune responses to antigens, how these are not unique silos of your body that don't integrate, that are operating independently. Can you talk about how these are all really integrated? And
Yeah. So the thing is that medicine is siloed. So the way we train physicians is we do all start off in medical school, so we're learning everything. But then after that, you start branching off. And so you become an expert in GI. So all you're focusing on is the GI tract and the microbiome and what have you. And I'm a neurologist, so I just focus on just the nervous system and so on and so forth. Everybody's got their own areas that they become the world's expert on. And the problem is that the body doesn't really care about this kind. It's just one, right? And so they all organs talk to one another. They all need one another to function, right? So if you upset one, the others are going to get, something's going to happen to the others too. So when you're seeing a patient with some kind of disease, you don't know exactly where it started, but what you're seeing is the sum total of what's really happening everywhere. A perfect example is a patient with diabetes. Okay. Now it starts with the pancreas and it starts with the islet cells, and it starts with the fact that they're not producing insulin. But the time you and I see a patient with diabetes, they've got a diabetic retinopathy, they've got a neuropathy, they've got some cardiac dysfunction, they've got some microinfarcts, they've got vascular disease, they got all kinds of stuff happening to every single organ system. So they present with multi-organ dysfunction, although it started with one. Now, if you want to treat a patient with diabetes, you got to treat all aspects of it. So we've got to look at the sum total, right, as physicians.
yeah, it's so important. And my background is as a pediatrician and an internist. I also do lifestyle medicine and lipidology. So I try to have a big, broad width and depth of understanding. In one sense, when I decided what to do, many people have double boarded, always think I could still specialize. And I thought, if I specialize, it's like I'm saying no to the other organ systems. And yet you want to take care of the whole person. And part of why we do the podcast and why I have a passion is that often these are people who don't get the evidence-based holistic approach. And we're trying to see how all of these are involved. And unfortunately, the best care isn't going to 8 different specialists for this. It's not uncommon that I'll see somebody after years of seeing many doctors and nobody's put this together and integrating. And this is often an orphan disease. Not that it's uncommon, like from the NIH, an orphan rare drug for a rare disease, but orphan meaning there is no person that really wants to take ownership. In fact, when we talk about research in Norway, they've done every few years they'll research who are the most prestigious and least prestigious illnesses. The CFS fibro has always been ranked at the bottom of the as far as prestige. Getting leukemia or having a heart attack is pretty prestigious from the medical perspective, but these are the group of patients that many people go, oh, great, she's back on the schedule. I told her to exercise more and avoid stress and relax more, and they're still back. And
these are my most favorite patients because I like the challenge and I like the aspect that they are the diseases that other people cannot really diagnose well. So I think intellectually they are the most rewarding and they're the most needy. So they need help the most. But it is a failure of our medical system. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Yes, you need to specialize to be able to understand and go in depth into certain aspects of various kinds of diseases and understand them well. But yes, we don't have anybody who can integrate all these things together. And you need that as well. You need the generalists. The problem with the generalists is that oftentimes it is hard for them to understand all the aspects of the patient's disease. You know? But we need all of us to work as a team together to make sure that generalist gets educated in the aspects of what the patient really has so that they feel comfortable in handling their patients.
Yeah. Any other thoughts that you have from the study that we haven't covered so far that you think are important and maybe surprising or especially insightful, both for you or the others involved in the research?
Yeah. I think every patient wants to know what can you do to help me at this stage, right? So we talked a lot about, okay, we believe your disease. So they all say, yes, fine. Okay, you believe my disease. Now what? Do something to help me here. And still, day in and day out, I'm troubled by it. So patients themselves have been trying all kinds of. If the physician cannot offer something to you, the patient is desperate. They're gonna try something or another. And so there are two aspects to it. Number one is they can try things and they can get hurt, either hurt financially or actually physically get hurt from what they're taking in, right? And so what patients have also found is by they have actually found certain things that do help them. Now they don't know if this is specific for their illness or others will be benefiting from it. So people have started putting together these lists of various kinds of things that, okay, low dose naltrexone, maybe some other whatever they're taking it, or this herbal or that thing that tries to help themselves. So I think what we need to do is we need to really have a good list of things, see out of that what makes the most sense and what doesn't. And we need to do what I've advocated for is what calls platform studies to help these patients. And platform studies, if you have a list of 100 things and you and I start going through that list and doing clinical trials on each one of them, it's going to take us 100 years. Long before, after you and I are done and dead, we still won't go through that list. But we need to help patients today. So what you can do is you do platform studies. That means you study multiple arms at the same time. So I could do 10 arms at the same time, have one control study, one control arm, and compare all the others and see what's actually making a difference. Yeah. And that's how we need to move quickly with clinical trials. We need to move expeditiously with clinical trials. And we don't need 2,000 patients in each arm. Okay. Because we want to find the ones, it's true, we could miss something that could be effective, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and find the ones that have the largest effect size. Yeah.
Yep.
Properly characterize these patients and go through these kinds of things. And that's the direction I'd like to move to try and help these patients. We need to find things quickly. We need to help these patients now. We've already been waiting too late. We have all the necessary tools and we have a list of reagents that we should be moving forward with.
Just to get some details about some of the testing that was finding no difference, many people who are struggling may go to, shall we say, evidence-based approaches and may have been told that they have a difference in lead levels or some other rare metals or other things in their body that is causing this, and maybe trying things like chelation or other things. Did you find any differences in levels of
No.
metals or other things in?
Our sample size was small, so at least within that sample size, we didn't find anything. No.
Sure. And with that, clinically, many people have been told sometimes that, oh, you have this to go on this chelation, which ends up being potentially costly from a financial standpoint.
Harmful too. You got to be
Yeah.
very careful. Small changes in metals don't really do anything to you.
Sure.
If small changes in metal was the answer, we'd all be dead.
There's a lot of talk about inflammation, and you didn't do any brain biopsies. That's not possible to biopsy somebody's brain. You can do the spinal tap to get the neurotransmitter differences, but there's talk about potential inflammation, these support cells in the brain, and maybe there's differences with that. Do you have any comment? I don't think the study specific obviously wasn't doing biopsies. It's very hard to do in a setting to not cause harm. What's your thoughts on potential inflammation within the central nervous system contributing to this?
Okay, so we looked at a lot of inflammatory markers in the spinal fluid, and we didn't find much. And that is telling. So, what we did not do is a particular type of PET scan that uses a marker of microglial cell activation called TSPO, and there are a number of others that people have come up with now. And I think there's one old Japanese study that showed some abnormalities, and everybody hangs their hat on that thing. But I think that needs to be reproduced, and that needs to be done. So if I were to do yet another kind of study, I would definitely do a PET scan using these kinds of ligands, because that question needs to be settled, whether there really is any hint of inflammation in the brain or not. Mhm. And that, in my mind, remains unsettled right now.
And that's interesting to connect as a clinical lipidologist. We know there's inflammation that's affecting cardiovascular and cells, and penetration to the brain comes through those arteries, but there was no difference that you've discovered. Any other thoughts that you have from the study that you want to bring up?
So what I would like to also point out is in the long COVID patients, there are studies with this PET ligand. You can find differences. So that's why I think it's important to do it in ME/CFS. And I wish we.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay, so the way PET works is it's a radioactive study. You have these molecules that bind to particular molecules within the brain, and the molecules have a radioactive thing like for radioactive fluorine or F18, and you can then measure wherever it binds, and the amount of radioactivity reflects the amount of that molecule that is. So there's something called a ligand to TSPO, and that is present on activated microglial cells. So what we're talking about is innate immune activation in the brain means that the microglial cells within the brain have become hyperactive. Okay, that's a sign of inflammation. So this ligand would then tell you how much microglial cell activation is present in the brain. Usually, if you have enough microglial cell activation, they're producing all kinds of cytokines, and the cytokines are released into the spinal fluid. So we know that there's not massive amounts of activation, because otherwise we would have found it in the spinal fluid for sure. Is it possible that we could have missed some, and maybe there was still some microglial cell activation in the brain that we didn't pick up in the spinal fluid? That is a possibility. And so that's why I think that study needs to be done, and it could be informative one way or the other, absence or presence.
And did you do any gut microbiome
Oh, yeah.
evaluation? What did you find in the study regarding the
Yeah,
gut?
we did find abnormalities, and I'm not an expert, but we had a whole slew of experts in gut microbiome, and they're actually writing up subsequent papers on the gut microbiome. And so they will be coming out shortly.
But they found differences in biome?
Differences. And now the thing in my mind is it a chicken or the egg story? What comes first? Is the gut microbiome abnormal because they have ME/CFS and we think persistent immune abnormalities, and maybe that leads to the abnormality in the gut microbiome? Or is it the gut microbiome is abnormal and that's why it's causing all these other abnormalities? I don't know how you sort one out versus the other. But nonetheless, they are abnormalities, and that we will be publishing in subsequent papers in more detail. Although we do have some within the parent manuscript as well, but there's a lot more work that they did on it that's in there.
Sure. I'm probably getting into all the different genuses, species, the quantity, and trying to. That's such a growing area of research, and so much of medicine is recognizing how when we were in med school, we never conceived you could actually measure that, because you could never get samples, and now to think just from a simple stool sample, you can get the remnants of the bacteria and the DNA of those, and then type and quantify through all this advanced testing.
Yeah, what they do is not only they look at it in the stool sample, they also look at it in blood. Because if there is a breakdown in your gut barrier, then these bits and pieces of these microbiome or the DNA, whatever, is seeping into the blood, and they're generating an immune response against it. So they actually do a lot of things. They look at the stool, then they look at the blood for remnants of these things, and they look for immune responses against these things in the blood. So I'm learning through this process as well as I'm doing these things. I'm
Well,
getting to know
well,
how sophisticated all this technology
well,
really is.
it's an area of strong interest for me as a lifestyle medicine doctor, knowing the foundation so much can have an effect on the food you eat. And what we're understanding is that the more healthy natural plant fibers you get, the bacteria that are good for our immune system thrive on those. When you don't have enough fiber, the gut bacteria often are digesting the gut itself, the slime of the gut, that's that protective lining. Then you get this bacteria, the bad bacteria, then having a quicker access into the bloodstream, which would all have a factor. Many people who often have CFS, if you're fatigued all the time, are more susceptible to the calorie dense, low fiber diet that makes their brain happy. Then you go, which came first? And all of these are integrated. It's easy to say, eat healthy. One thought, when I looked at your study, like you said, I really liked the immune differences, and then also looked at how the brain responded. And it made me think, in the world of fibro, and a lot of this overlaps now as we're learning more with neurodivergent people, fall under the umbrella of ADHD and autism. One of the interesting things was that you did extensive testing, psychological testing, but the neuropsych testing, we now know, doesn't pick up ADHD. They didn't do any of the adult Conners rating scales or the DIVA questionnaires. The ones you have don't typically pick that up. Dr. Joel Young has done research looking at that. And there's other papers throughout the world where we've done smaller studies looking at CFS and using stimulants to help, and showing significant improvement in some of that. They also, as we now know, there often can be differences in the brain function. Different parts of the brain are integrated, and that fatigue. And I know for many of my patients who have coexisting CFS, fibro type things, who have also diagnosed ADHD, when they treat it, they also have improvement in that effort. They can persist.
Very exciting. Yeah. Somebody should look at it. And if they have the expertise, that would be wonderful if they could look at ADHD. I'm not an expert in the field, but yeah, I'm sure there are things. We did the best that we could, but I'm sure there are
Oh,
things that
sure.
we didn't do. And there are experts out there. They should certainly look at it.
Yeah. I am actually going to be interviewing Joel Young next week.
good.
And he's done research. He's a psychiatrist who does research with clinical work, running a clinic in Michigan. He found those similar patients, and then he was finding these higher co-occurrence. Actually, CFS, in the study that he had in January at one of the conferences, was actually the most common diagnosis of somebody entering their mental health clinic. They're going to a psychiatric clinic. They actually made the biggest percentage. It was not the majority. There were other illnesses, but CFS, actually, they were screening for it. Most psychiatric clinics are not screening for CFS, because it's, again, in the world of silo, that's not in the DSM, right? They were finding, which I said, wow, that's quite high. And I think in that study, they had 55% or so of those who had CFS. They also were screening for ADHD, had co-occurring ADHD. So there's pretty high co-occurrences in the fibro world, or chronic pain syndrome world, which all these are different names for different phenotype emphasize of things. Between 30 to 80% of them have these higher co-occurrences. So it's an area. And then we now know too, with the autism, trying to understand higher functioning, many of them have higher rates of autoimmune diseases. And so that neuroimmune kind of connection, like you're talking about, with differences in these immune cells, I encourage my patients to actually give a longitudinal history. I say, come back, write down your life story. And it's not uncommon that many of them go, oh, I always had a lot of illnesses when I was a kid. I always had, and it's, oh, you bringing up today that we are finding this. And again, wow, how complicated is our immune system changed since when we were in med school to find. It's one thing to say there are these checkpoints there, they happen. What can we do? In a perfect world, I'm guessing studies show sleep deprivation makes you more susceptible if you're exposed to a cold virus, but you're sleep deprived, you're 5 times more likely to develop clinical symptoms. So I just think it's great. When I saw this study, I'm always trying to look for updated areas of this. And what you have done is so important within the medical field, and understanding and growing this, but now trying to get this out there. I think knowing that there's passionate researchers, you share the passion with me. These are people who are often neglected, misunderstood, and many hopeless to know there are doctors who are caring about this.
Yeah, that's very sad. In medicine, that's our history of medicine is like that. Even patients with seizures at one time were thought to be hysterical. And you would go to the priest, they yell in your ear and think that they'll fix your problem. Patients who were paralyzed were thought to be faking it. And patients with dystonia were also thought to be functional. There's a biological basis. So the unfortunate thing about our history of medicine, particularly for neurological diseases, is that when we don't understand what it is, we just blame the patient. And I think that that's a huge mistake throughout the history of medicine. And I think the ME/CFS, long COVID, Gulf War illness, all these things have also been treated the same way. But I think in the recent past now, and hopefully we've made some contribution to that, is to shed light on their illness and show the world that there is a true biological basis for it. And we need to try and find ways to be able to treat them adequately.
Thank you so much. I'm a clinician and love learning and applying this to patients, and I wish I could double myself and put one for myself doing. You can't do the clinical work without the science work, and you were able to do that kind of bridge bench work with that. Thanks so much for taking your time to share your wisdom and insight and passion for these invisible illnesses like CFS.
Thanks very much for having me on your podcast. And you're doing a superb job taking care of patients and spreading the word. I mean, that itself is of great value to patients and physicians. Thank you so much for what you do.
You're welcome.